Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Sunday, August 21st, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm returning to your podcast feeds on the weekend for once because I couldn't wait till Monday to release the second part of my reaction to the Rings of Power soundtrack being released. In the last episode, we covered the first 20 tracks on the album, and today we're going to go through the final 17 tracks, as well as the 2 bonus tracks that are available on Amazon Music. As I said last episode, a fair warning here is that I'm not someone who has a deep knowledge of musical theory or composition, so all of this is more of my unscripted reaction to what I've been hearing as a layman. Also, I thought it might be worth putting a spoiler and speculation warning on both of these episodes. As pointed out to me by a helpful listener on Twitter, as we analyse these tracks, we're speculating on what scenes they might occur alongside. And now we've had so much information and we've been speculating on this show for so long, it's getting to the point where our guesses and theories might in fact be spoilers, intentionally or not. So if you'd like to avoid that and go into the series pretty much fresh, feel free to come back to this episode after the show airs. However, before we begin, let us start with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, we return to where we left off, as our reading once again comes from the Silmarillion, the Ainulindale. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes, and pipes and trumpets, and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Ilúvatar to a great music. And a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies, woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. And the places of the dwelling of Ilúvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Ilúvatar, by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Ilúvatar, after the end of days. Okay, so just like last episode, this is me going through the brief notes I have, no script, so let's get into it. Starting off where we left off, we have one of my favourite tracks in the whole soundtrack, number 21, Nolwa Matar. I've been talking about this track since it was released on Friday, and I just can't get enough of it. My only complaint about this track is that it's not long enough, and I need more tracks like it, just give me more battle music set to Elvish choral singing. That would be my request. But as I discussed on Twitter when the track list was first released, the title Nolwa Matar means brave warrior in Quenya. And so I can only assume this is Galadriel's battle theme, which I love. I haven't been able to decipher any of the Quenya lyrics, really, except for at 14 seconds, I think the line begins An Kalima, which means in Quenya, brightest. You may recognise that word from The Lord of the Rings when Frodo uses the incantation Aya Eärendil Elenion en Kalima when using the file of Galadriel in Shelob's Lair. That full line translates to Hail Eärendil, brightest of stars, and so I just think it's so cool we're getting that link to the later Third Age story through Galadriel's character and her music, and I think it's wonderful. As for the track itself, I don't know what I love about it. I just love everything. Its intensity, the singing, it's just, I wish I could play this on repeat forever. But we follow that up with something that's perhaps a little less enjoyable to listen to, only in the sense that it's imposing and scary, and that would be track 22, Nampat. Now, following on from Galadriel's theme, this is clearly a theme for the orcs. We've heard this in a couple of promo clips, and surprisingly, I did manage to guess that this was Black Speech before I'd even heard it, because when the track list was released, I was looking at the word, and I noticed that Pat is actually is a similar sound that we can find in the ring verse, such as words as Krimbatul, because it shares that at sound. Now, while I'm no philologist, obviously, I had a very interesting conversation on Twitter with Sean Marchese, who you may know from the Prancing Pony podcast, and the Tolkien scholar Dr. Andrew Higgins. Now, through our conversation together, the closest I think we've gotten to deciphering the lyrics of the actual chanting is Nampat Shakaz, Nampat Burzumpak. And again, that's a pretty rough guesstimation, but it sounds right to me. So if we break that down, what do we know about Black speech? Well, from the existing but limited notes we have on Black speech, Shak means Lord, and Burz means dark. So we can kind of already tell that this is something that repeats a line about the darkness and the Lord. Now, with these two clues, Sean came up with the theory that Namp may actually be the verb for release in Black speech, and while this is speculation, if that was the case, then the chant would translate to something along the lines of release the Lord, release the darkness. So it's interesting to consider that while we know the orcs are under the leadership of Adar in the first season, are they actually working for him to release their true Dark Lord, whether that's a reference to Sauron or Morgoth? We might be fumbling in the dark here a little bit, but it is fascinating to think what the chant might mean. And I do hope we get some official lyrics sooner rather than later, because that would really help. But moving from the orc chant to a much more beautiful theme, at 23 we get A Plea to the Rocks. And this is an amazing track. I love it. I think we can almost be certain that it's related to that scene that we've seen in trailers of the dwarven princess Disa singing surrounded by other dwarves. In that scene, we see the other dwarves holding what looks like, I would say, ceremonial braziers or offerings, and we have heard rumours from Fellowship of Fans that there will be a scene in Season 1 involving some kind of mining accident for the dwarves that's going to result in some of them dying. So this could be a sort of funeral lament. Whatever the purpose, I just love the mix of Sophia Nomvetti's beautiful singing, and then combined that with the deeper chanting in the background and the almost serene soundtrack that sits behind it. As we discussed in part 1, I think this track reminds me again of a bit of McCreary's work and a bit of Zimmer's work. Again, it reminds me of some of Zimmer's work on Gladiator, whereas this definitely evokes McCreary's work on God of War. He would use a lot of similar tracks when wanting to have a slightly sad yet ethereal feeling. But regardless, I can already tell that this scene is going to be incredibly powerful, incredibly emotional, and I love how this track feels like it's coming out of the world rather than something that's painted on top, which is a problem you often have in soundtracks where you feel like the music is trying to lead you on an emotional journey rather than complement the emotions you're seeing on screen. And as if these last few tracks couldn't get any better, next up we get a track which I have been playing over and over again for days, which is track 24, This Wandering Day. For me, it immediately evokes memories of The Road Goes Ever On and The Last Goodbye. It immediately places you in that world, and the almost folk nature of it resonates perfectly for me with the Harfoot culture. It's also worth noting that the singer for this track is Megan Richards, who plays the Harfoot character Poppy. It'll be interesting to see if she sings this track in a scene during the season, or if this is more going to be like the films, where it's a track that just plays over the credits. Now, on the actual song itself, my very good friend on Twitter, Kylie, helpfully transcribed the lyrics to this song, and I'll link that transcription in the show notes. Hopefully we're going to have Kylie on the podcast later this week, by the way, so that we can do a special episode all about Harfoots, because I've been severely lacking in my coverage of the Harfoots, and we need to correct that. But returning to the lyrics, I think there's a really interesting story in there. The lyrics to me suggest that if you look at that first verse, it suggests that perhaps the Harfoots weren't always wandering, and perhaps there were stationary people that have had to move. Perhaps they've been driven west by some darkness, which is a very similar story to the awakening of men, which is told in the Silmarillion. And given the fact that hobbits and half-orcs were all descended distantly from men, it would make sense if they've had to migrate westward for a particular reason. But beyond the literal story of the lyrics, I just love how it echoes Tolkien's themes, of wonder and family and journeys, and even paraphrases the famous line of "not all who wander are lost." So I think it's beautiful. I love this song. I'm sure I'll know all the lyrics by the end of the week. And honestly, would it be too much to hope for to get some more Half-Orc songs in the show? I would be happy if they're in all 5 seasons, if it means we get more of this, honestly. Okay, next up we've got track 25, which is, and excuse my pronunciation for this, I think it's Scherzo or Scherzo for violin and swords. This next one is a surprisingly fun and upbeat track. I don't know a lot about the history of this type of music. From what I understand, a scherzo or a scherzo is a type of more upbeat, fast-paced music, and I assume the title here is a reference to John Williams' famous score for Indiana Jones, which included a track called Scherzo for Motorcycle and Orchestra. So I think that's just a nice little reference to, an esteemed member of the composer industry, by McCreary. And to be honest, I do think this track is Bear having some fun in his score, because while the opening lines are very upbeat and playful, I do actually think this will be music used for some form of battle, or obviously sword fight. I don't know whether it'll be a grand battle or just a fight between two people. Maybe it's even a sparring match, who knows. But towards the end, it takes a much more triumphant and epic tone, which leads me to believe it will be for an actual battle. Now, the fact that it's so short does make me worry that this is perhaps the start of a battle that's, going really well and upbeat and hey, lots of fun, until everything goes downhill. But, either way, it'll be really enjoyable to watch some kind of fight scene with this playing in the background, and I'm already looking forward to it. After that comes a very different track, which is track 26, Sailing into Dawn. Now, this is a majestic piece of orchestration with the core of the Numenor theme present throughout. If we're going to break down the title to start with, given that dawn comes in the east, I would suspect this is going to be our scene of the Númenórean army departing to sail east and fight the rising threat in Middle-earth. Guessing from the trailers and from the literal drums we hear in this track, I imagine those scenes of Númenórean soldiers drumming a marching beat will blend perfectly with this. Again, McCreary making it feel like the music is coming out of the world rather than being superimposed upon it. Most interesting for me is that we get the full Galadriel theme appear at the 2:20 mark, and as we know she'll be returning to Middle-earth with this force, it's great to see that the musical blend reinforces her role as a leader and as a prominent figure within this score, even with a military force that isn't her own. I also think that the Númenóreans are getting such a heroic score for this expedition in particular. It's interesting because given we know in future their military setting sail will not always be a good thing, I think it's a really nice way to subvert expectations for audiences who know and mislead the show viewers who perhaps don't know the story of Númenor in the future. So I think that's really interesting. After that, we get track 27, For the Southlands. To be honest, this next track is slightly self-explanatory. It's clearly some kind of battle theme for the Southlanders, who I assume are going to try and put up a fight against the invading orcs. The menacing tone that's adopted after 1 minute 20, I mean, it really doesn't bode well for their brave stand against this evil force. There's a lovely back and forth tug of war within the music after that, and it's almost this tug of war for momentum that follows for a minute or so. And because you get that Southlander theme, which I think is also present in Halbrand's theme, reoccurring after the 3 minute 10 mark, it gives this sense of the back and forth. Are they going to win? Are they going to lose? But most worrying for me is after the 3 minute 40 mark, you get this very sad and somber vocalization coming through, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get a montage of the Southlanders falling in valiant defense, and probably seeming without hope until we reach our next track 28, Cavalry. Now, I think I am spoiling myself for Ewan for this scene, but I put that at the top of the show, so you have been warned. But clearly for me, there is going to be hope for the Southlanders, and it's going to come in the form of Númenórean cavalry we've seen in the trailers. We've seen Galadriel, Halbrand leading this cavalry force. We've seen them riding into the village. I think for me, this much more urgent and frenetic version of the Númenor theme that leads us into the first minute of this track, it's really your classic war theme that you might expect on any kind of period score. And I have to say, I'm really excited to see this battle on screen, especially with this soundtrack. It's interesting again, though, that we get Galadriel's theme appearing briefly a couple of times after the 3-minute mark. So I think we can glean from that she's clearly going to be one of our key points of view throughout this battle, and perhaps she's going to be really the hero of the battle, despite all the Númenóreans who are obviously going to play a key role. Following on from that, we change tones a little bit, and I think we might even be changing settings. So track 29, Water and Flame. This is a really interesting track for me, not just for the music, but also for the title. Because when we look at the title, I would assume this has something to do with the scenes from the Comic-Con trailer of Númenórean ships burning or maybe even exploding in the docks at night. So you get that literal contrast of water and flame. To be honest, I'm still at a loss for how exactly that's happening. Maybe it's got something to do with these all clad in white cultists or priests that we saw in the same trailer. We'll get onto them in a second. So maybe there's some sorcery at play, but equally maybe it's just regular old sabotage, and this is a way of showing us the discontent and civil unrest within Númenor. Either way, I've really struggled to pick up any clear musical clues in this track, beyond what I assume are elements of the Númenor theme, but if you have any ideas about this track, let me know, because this is one that I struggled a little bit with. Now we move on to, a very different track. This is track 30, In the Mines. This one's fascinating to me as well. It's one of the longer pieces in the soundtrack. It lasts for over 8 minutes, and I do wonder if it's used in maybe segmented parts throughout the season. So what I mean is that I don't think we're ever going to have this full 8-minute track play out across one scene. Instead, if you break it down, I think in the opening minute or so, we get parts of the Elrond half-elven theme. So that suggests to me that that's going to be part of his visit to Khazad-dûm. However, after the 1 minute 30 mark, we get a more somber tone adopted, and it morphs into something with a more intense quality, I would say, to it. Again, I wonder if this section up until the 2 minute 30 mark is to do with the discovery and mining of Mithril, because if we remember the track we discussed in the first half that we thought was about Durin and Elrond and maybe discovering Mithril, I think you can hear some of the same qualities there. As we reach the middle section, it brings us back to that core Khazad-dûm theme, that core Durin theme, but it seems like something that could be applicable to many different types of scenes. So I think there's less sleuthing we can do here, but there's clearly a big part of this score which could be used in many parts of the Dwarven storyline. However, after the 6 minute mark, we get what I really thought of and what it reminded me of was a more traditional theme, something more based in chanting and low reverberations that I thought of reminded me of the Shaw soundtracks from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbits when he had to portray the dwarves in his score. But it's also melded with a much slower version of the Khazad-dûm theme, played on what I assume is a single string instrument. But it's very difficult for me to know what this might be about. I'm not sure what to make of it, but one thing I will say, and I've been saying this for a few episodes now, I love the complexity, I love the variation of tones we're getting for the dwarves. It was something that was seriously missing from the Peter Jackson films, and I want to see a real depth to dwarvish culture, and one of the ways we can do that is through the music, so hopefully that's what we're getting here. We've now covered a lot of themes which I think are very defined, but as we head into our last few themes, this is where we're going to be doing a lot of speculating. Again, if you don't want to hear theories about the events of the second half of the season in particular, feel free to tune out. But these tracks, I think, are all from the last few episodes of the season, or maybe not, but that's my theory. So let's get into some of these more mysterious ones. So at 31, we have The Veil of Smoke. Now, this is another one of those tracks that I'm not quite sure what to make of, which is turning into a common theme for my analysis in part 2. It's not a particularly ominous theme, despite the title, especially in the first 2.5 minutes, which actually ends with Galadriel's theme softly reoccurring, followed again by a very brief rendition of the Numenor motif. And at the 3-minute 30 mark, we get the sounds of Halbrand's theme, or maybe it's the Southland's theme, it's always difficult to tell. So when you put all that together, I have to speculate that this has something to do with the scenes we've seen of Galadriel standing covered in ash and surrounded by a burnt-out village. It makes me think that I wonder if the Veil of Smoke is actually a very literal meaning here, that in the aftermath of whatever has caused this conflagration, this massive explosion or burning in the village, we actually find all our heroes in a literal veil of smoke, trying to find each other, help the wounded, find the dead, recover from whatever's happening. So for me, this could be a really interesting scene. But again, it's the tone of the track that's making it difficult to me. It doesn't feel ominous. It more feels maybe disjointed, but still reasonably peaceful might be the wrong word. But yeah, as you can tell, I don't really know what to make of it. Again, if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear in the comments on Twitter. 32, on the other hand, I have a pretty defined idea of. It's one of the most unique tracks here, and I actually have to give a shout out to another one of my friends on Twitter, T, who uses the handle Reigns of Castamere. We were talking about this in our group chat, and both of us instantly said the opening of this track rang huge familiarity bells, but not with Bear McCreary or any of the other composers I've talked about so far, but with Ramin Djawadi, who composed the Game of Thrones soundtrack, and I believe is now doing House of the Dragon as well. And for us, this track's opening instantly reminded us of the Sons of the Harpy theme, because they both build on this opening of, it's chanting, but it's coming out so venomously, it sounds like the hissing of a snake, and it's reinforced by that ominous deep percussion in the background at first. And so that repetitive chanting, that hissing, for me immediately spelled evil, conspiracy, everything about it screams danger. But the track as well really grows in scale, and as we lead up to the 2-minute mark, and as we especially hit the 3-minute mark, additional voices join the chanting. And this is where I think we can decipher that the language is probably also black speech here. It's hard to tell, but I do think it is black speech. I think the logical conclusion here is that this track has something to do with those white-robed, mysterious cultists. So whether perhaps within the show they're called the Mystics, which would be a very interesting term. I don't really know what to make of that. We know that sorcery is a real thing in Tolkien's world, so mystics is another word that could be applied to that area. And as we speculated on an earlier episode, I suspect these figures are likely part of some kind of cult of Morgoth or followers of Sauron. I wouldn't be surprised if they have something to do with the magical and ominous broken blade that we see Theo wielding in the trailers. But what's really interesting for me is that Galadriel's theme reappears several times within this track, which I wouldn't really expect, but it appears most prominently around the 5-minute 20 mark, which is maybe just there to suggest that she's in direct conflict with the Mystics, whoever they are, but it's really interesting she's there in the sound of that track. I think we can hear alongside the chanting, I think the black speech words we can definitely hear are Ishi-Burzum being chanted. So it builds on that idea again of Galadriel and Sauron in opposition to one another. So maybe that's why she's there, to counterbalance the black speech, the tones of Sauron. Interestingly, again, the Southlands theme reemerges after the 6-minute mark, so that suggests a location for where they are. We know from a recent, I believe it was Time magazine article, that these mystics, these cultists, are actually coming from the Far East. They're coming from Rhûn. So I think what we have to do here is make the link between the mystics, the broken blade, the explosion in the village, and Theo, and say that perhaps, and again, massive speculation here, could be spoilers, could be me being way off base, but I have to suspect that the mystics are either searching for maybe that blade because it's some kind of relic of the First Age, some relic of Morgoth or Sauron, and that's where all these storylines collide. But again, big speculation there. Following that track, we have number 33, Perilous Whisperings. This track confuses me. I don't know what to make of it, because it opens with elements of the Southlands theme, but that theme is in opposition to quite frenetic, frantic strings, and then layered on top are these angelic yet creepy choral accompaniments, and as the track builds, they grow in intensity. The issue here is that it's a very short track, and we don't have much to work with, so I don't really have much speculation, but given the fact there's no shortage of peril in this show, whatever these whispers are, they're not good. It could be something we're completely unaware of yet, but I'm going to put my money on it being related to the Southlands plot, given the presence of that theme at the start. Next up, okay, this track really fascinates me. So track 34, The Broken Line. Let's go from the top. The opening vocals are straight out of the opening to the track from the first half of the album, In the Beginning. Now, if you remember from our last episode, we suspect In the Beginning to be the musical accompaniment to the prologue from this show, which we have plenty of reason to suspect will be told by Galadriel, will probably be from her perspective. So as we'd expect, Galadriel's theme enters just before the 1 minute mark, but then it's followed by a mix of that prologue music in the beginning with some more worrying strings that suggest something evil at play. And here's where we get into potentially big spoiler territory. So again, just a warning. This one I think is a really big spoiler if I'm right, so skip ahead maybe 2 minutes in the podcast episode if you want to avoid this. We're going to be talking about the Season 1 villain. As we discussed in our second ever episode of this podcast, I think we called it How to Name Your Villain, there have been rumours for a long time that the Season 1 villain Adar is in some way related to Galadriel. A lot of these rumours come from Fellowship fans, and they're often quite on the money with their rumours. So, if he is related in some way to Galadriel, whether he's a brother or one of her family or friends that was captured and twisted, maybe corrupted by Morgoth or Sauron, who, by the way, Sauron's theme reappears around the 3 minute 10 mark, I think this music only adds to that theory, because all this track is screaming to me is that we're being given musical cues of Galadriel's own theme being corrupted and invaded by darkness. Then we have to think about the track's title, The Broken Line. Could this be referring to a family line? We know that the House of Finarfin's line was almost completely broken by Galadriel's brothers being killed in the Wars of the First Age, leaving her alone alive. But what if we can go even further and say that the noble line of that house was broken and corrupted by Sauron, in the literal twisting and corruption of one of the elves' best and most noble families through this corruption? So what if Adar is that very literal broken line? Again, I realise this is all speculation. I may be so far off base that I'm going to sound like a crazy person once the season airs, but given the musical cues, given the rumours we've had, I have to say I'm now firmly in the camp of Adar and Galadriel being tied together by something as fundamental as family and bloodline. Well, if the last track was one that fascinates me above all others. This one is just beautiful. This is track 35, The Wise One. I actually think it requires a little less speculation here, given that the track is primarily made up of the musical themes from the Strangers theme and the Harfoots theme. My speculation here, pure and simple, we're getting the end of the Strangers' journey with the Harfoots, and perhaps they're parting ways, because the stranger has rediscovered his purpose and his identity. It's worth stating, I guess, that if you believe the theory that the stranger is one of the wizards, then the title for this track, The Wise One, would be incredibly apt, given the fact that this is where the name of the wizards, the Istari, is derived from, because Istari literally means those who know. So if you're going for those who know, the wise ones, those with wisdom, it all makes sense to me. In terms of tone, it actually reminds me a little bit of the score at the end of The Return of the King for the Grey Havens, and I do wonder whether this is intentional, because not only would there be a parallel of the wizards and the hobbits, but also the fact that it may be depicting a bittersweet parting between these two people or peoples. There's also something in the music that gives me the feeling of embarking on a journey, which would make loads of sense if the Harfoots are carrying on their wandering, but also if the stranger is continuing their own journey. Now, what could his journey be? Well, if you believe he's a wizard, what if it's to find his best friend and fellow blue wizard? And I know that's just me hoping he's a blue wizard, but it would explain his departure from the Harfoots if that is what we're hearing in the music. Overall, I love this track. It's one you can have on repeat for hours because it's a long track, but also it's just so calming and relaxing. I would go as far to say that for me, this is one of my top 5 tracks. I really do think this is one of the masterpieces from the album. Our penultimate track on the album, number 36, True Creation Requires Sacrifice. This is both an interesting title and an interesting track. Again, we've got to start from the top here, because the opening is clearly Galadriel's theme, but it's in that more somber tone performed by a single vocalist, which I think we heard on the Sundering Seas track, which we kind of theorized, well, maybe that's Galadriel at her lowest. And to me, again, this feels like a bittersweet track. Maybe perhaps because Galadriel is realizing she can't continue her hunt for Sauron forever. Maybe she realizes she can't fight her way out of this, or she can't defeat him purely through her own will. But as we approach the 1 minute 50 mark, those familiar urgent strings return, and it blends into something, to me, a bit more menacing, and that continues throughout the middle section. But then we switch up again, because at 3 minute 45, it turns into something quite different for me. And the tune there actually reminds me of another Ramin Djawadi. It reminds me there of another Ramin Djawadi composition from Game of Thrones, but this time the tune to me instantly reminded me of Light of the Seven. Not sure what that's signaling, but it sounds to me like the track may be saying, okay, Galadriel is realizing her own humility and her own inability to fight this evil alone, but it also sounds like her fears are well-founded and the danger remains and persists. As for the title of the track, True Creation Requires Sacrifice, for me this perfectly represents Tolkien's own ideas around creation, the danger of creation when it becomes obsessive and when it becomes about possession. And what I find most interesting about that is that this title could equally be applied to a character who we do not think we've heard in the soundtrack yet, Celebrimbor. Because, in fact, for me, this title, I wouldn't be surprised if this track and this title comes in many ways to represent the dynamic between Celebrimbor and Sauron when he's in his fair form, Anatar. During the whole manipulation to forge the Rings of Power, this idea of creation requiring sacrifice is very present in that story, most obviously when Sauron himself pours his own spirit and essence into the One Ring. That is a sacrifice. In fact, it's the one thing that made him vulnerable at the end of this all. So I think it's a fascinating track, but I wonder whether this is a track it is for this season, obviously, but the purpose of this track is to set us up for later seasons. Now, closing out the main tracks on the album, we have track 37, Where the Shadows Lie. I mean, not going to explain this to you like you're stupid, but we definitely have a self-explanatory title here. As anyone who's read Tolkien or even remembers the films will recognise, Where the Shadows Lie is a direct reference to the Ringverse, and specifically to the line referring to the land of Mordor. Now, as we've been talking about on Twitter this last week, it's very clear now that the Southlands are the area of the map that will actually become Mordor one day. We've seen a map of it in one of their latest teaser videos, and it is absolutely pre-Mordor, or as the joke has been going on social media, before-dor. So if this is true, it makes complete sense to me that perhaps at the end of Season 1, we're going to see that the Southlands are largely going to be abandoned by the people living there, by Bronwyn's people, and Sauron is going to be laying his plans for what will become in future his seat of power. Now, if you want some real speculation, which I think is wild and probably isn't true, but let's go with it anyway, could we perhaps even see some hint that Orodruin, Mount Doom that is going to erupt and cause this land to become uninhabitable, a place where the shadows, after a volcano has erupted, the shadows will quite literally lie there. Either way, whether that happens or not, I'm very excited that this is probably going to be our opening musical theme for Mordor, and one that will absolutely no doubt evolve in future seasons. Now, I did also promise we were going to cover the 2 bonus tracks. For those of you who don't know, if you stream this album on Amazon Music, you get 2 bonus tracks. So the first one is called Find the Light. Now, we know from interviews with the cast that the phrase, find the light and the shadow will not find you, that we heard in the Comic-Con trailer, is actually a mantra that Bronwyn tells her son, Theo, in this season. So we can be pretty sure that this track is a reference to that mother-son relationship, and perhaps even Theo's struggle with dark forces that I sadly suspect will try to corrupt him. It's interesting to me that this track doesn't contain many of those darker tones and sounds we've heard in other tracks, so I do suspect this is more of a broader theme for the 2, rather than just being about that corruption. Either way, for me, it's a very pleasant track. I look forward to seeing how it's used in the show, and even though I'm very worried about Bronwyn and Theo's fate, this is a great track for the 2 of them. And then we end our analysis with a track that really perplexes me. So this is the second bonus track, The Promised King. What an interesting title to end on. Now, I've done a bit of searching, and I don't think I can find a reference to a promised king or a king who was promised, at least not in the Second Age. I'm sure you could apply that to Aragorn maybe in his own way, or even Thorin in Erebor if you wanted to take that where there's a kind of prophetic return of a king. But within the Second Age setting, the title doesn't give me any clues. But if we turn to the music, let's see what we can hear. We can hear in the opening a version of Galadriel's theme played by a single string instrument and at a much lower pace. So what does that tell me? It tells me this is a more somber track, maybe even quite a sad track, and it's got to involve Galadriel somehow. So here's my wild theory. Could the title be a reference to Galadriel's brother Finrod? Now, Finrod in the First Age was a king in his own right, so could this music be a reference to him or some kind of flashback to him? We've actually seen now in teaser posters and in one of the clips there's a memorial or some kind of statue perhaps to Finrod which exists in Lindon alongside other similar statues and memorials, I assume to other great elves of the First Age who perished. So maybe this track is an accompaniment to Galadriel going there, mourning him, remembering him, maybe talking about him with Gil-galad. But honestly, I'm at a bit of a loss with this track, so what a great place to end other than to say, if you've got any ideas about this track, let me know, because I would be delighted to hear them. And that wraps up our reaction and analysis of the Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power Season 1 soundtrack. I mean, I said it at the top, I'll say it again now. I think this is a wonderful soundtrack. I think Bear McCreary has outdone himself. I think he's built on his previous work. I think he pays homage to Shaw without trying to replicate Shaw's music. And honestly, if McCreary doesn't win any awards for this soundtrack, there must be some great other composers out there, which I know there are, but honestly, I hope this wins some awards, because to me it's absolutely fascinating, and it's so complex and rich and powerful at times and emotional at times. I just love it. I absolutely do. But I know I'm biased. With that, that's all we have time for today. As with the last episode, if you have your views or comments on these tracks, what you think they might mean, what scenes they might relate to, drop us a comment on Twitter. Let us know what you think. Let's carry on the conversation there. Let me know what you think about which characters weren't on this soundtrack. Now, just before I recorded, we found out that after each episode, Amazon is going to release additional music, which, oh my god, we're going to get more than 39 tracks. That's amazing. But also, we should perhaps remember, therefore, that, okay, we haven't heard themes for Gil-galad or Pharazôn or Celebrimbor, but those might be coming. So let's hold our horse on those. But which characters did you want to see themes for? Who do you hope will get in future? And what kind of music would you like to hear in the rest of the soundtrack? As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We're coming into our last 2 weeks before the show is released, so also let me know what kind of episodes you'd like to hear. Is there a storyline I haven't covered yet? Should we do another listener Q&A? I'm happy to take your feedback, and hopefully we can do some really exciting episodes in the last 2 weeks. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with more discussion on the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namaria.